right. Well, thanks for participating in the discussion. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Looks like you did. Everyone has a smile on their face, so that's good. But ever since I can remember, I have had really, really poor eyesight. So ever since I was born, that's been something that I inherited the wrong genes from my parents, and so I've had really, really poor eyesight. Um, I've had a lot of eye doctor visits because of that, and it's gotten to the point now where if I need new glasses, often Danielle, my wife, will be like, "Hey, you should go to the doctor, and you should go to the eye doctor and see if your prescriptions change." And often I'll just say, no, not often. Every time I say, no, I'm not going because it's not changed. I'm still blind. So, but I've lived most of my life like this. I've had some surgeries in order to try and correct it. But you can imagine how not having great eyesight can be a limitation. When I was in first grade, one of my teachers put me into like a special reading class for kids who would struggle to comprehend what they were reading and also just struggle to read. Eventually, my teacher figured out, hey, Isaac is reading and comprehending fine. You just can't see. And so they took me out of it. Now, obviously, seeing created limitations as far as things like those go, but it also just gives you like very inaccurate depth perception. So the different sports that I played, everything I learned how to do was all muscle memory because it definitely wasn't like good depth perception or bodily awareness at all. But one of the things inaccurate depth perception created for me because of my poor eyesight was a fear of heights. And when I was in around 8th grade, my family was coming up to Minnesota because my mom was born and raised in west central Minnesota. So we would often pile in it was basically a church van. That's what we looked like in a 12-passenger van. Hopped in the Wheeler Church van and headed to Minnesota. One of our stops along the way was in Chicago, and my dad was like, hey, I've got a great idea. Let's go to the Sears Tower. And I was like, ha, 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 great, let's go. Because it's obviously like one of the taller buildings in the U.S., I think. And so not only is it the tallest, the elevator is super fast. So you go from one elevation to the next in like super speed time, in my mind at least. Oh, wrong one. Let's go. 1 second. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So that's the top of the Sears Tower, sometimes called the Willis Tower. I think it is now. I don't think Sears owns it. But anyway, yep, they probably don't. But then my dad had another great idea. Because I'm so scared of heights, when we got to the top, I was already like feeling pretty dizzy. And it's already a tall building, and so you can imagine it looked that much more tall to me. So my dad had another great idea. He was like, hey, why don't we take a family picture out on the little glass outlooks? And I wanted to absolutely like go livid on my dad because I was so upset. So I looked. Unfortunately, we do not have the picture of that, but I was not happy in the picture. You have probably had family pictures where you can tell someone was not happy or there was a fight before it. This was that kind of picture. So you can imagine that having poor eyesight, again, whether you have 20/20 vision or whether you have to wear glasses or contacts like me, you can imagine that any type of physical or mental handicap or any type of limitation, how it can affect the way you experience life. This kind of makes me think of what Jesus has to say about judgment in the Sermon on the Mount. So we're going to read that together. I'll go back. Do not judge. So this is in Matthew 7, starting in verse 1. Jesus says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." Take about 2 to 3 minutes and discuss your initial observations from the passage, and then we'll come back. All right, let's come back in for some discussion. I'd love to hear a few thoughts from the table on what our initial observations from Jesus' words are. Yeah, absolutely. You're talking about the mirror, the seeing our own reflection before we look at others. Yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing that, Evan. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? You can call someone out at your table that had a good thought, but isn't going to share. That's always fun. Okay, well, we will come back in for a second. So I think it's important for us to identify the tension that we see in the text. First off, a lot of this kind of speaks for itself, which is why a lot of us are silent, because it kind of speaks for itself in a way that's a little uncomfortable for us. But I think the tension in the text lies in who Jesus is addressing with his words, and also what kind of judgment he's referring to. So the clue, which I heard Christian Ann mention it at her table already, the clue in who Jesus is addressing comes in the word hypocrite. Jesus has some of his strongest words for the religious leaders of his day, and so he's addressing, no surprise, say it with me, the Pharisees. There you go. All right. So Jesus is addressing the Pharisees because they have or practice a kind of religion that is not only oppressive to others, but also oppressive to themselves. They oppress others with their beliefs, and they oppress themselves with those same beliefs as well, because beliefs have consequences, whether good or bad. And so the kind of religion that the Pharisees practiced, we've all heard about them, but just a refresher, they were some of the highest ranking officials in Jewish culture. And the kind of way that they saw the world and the religion that they practiced was a way of maximizing the flaws of others, but failing to understand their own. It is a life that's heavy on the letter and the specifics of the law, but not the heart of it. And so Jesus has these harsh words for them, often in his public ministry. Harsh, but very much meant to penetrate so that they can understand. This comes up in a couple of different places, but one place I can think of right now is when Jesus is criticized by the Pharisees for healing on the Sabbath, doing something really, really good, but the Pharisees are like, this is against the law, you shouldn't be doing this. And so there's a lot of times where they seem to bump heads. Now, a prayer, it even sounds weird coming out of my mouth, but a prayer that a Pharisee would pray when they would wake up in the morning would be, thank God I'm not a Gentile, and thank God I'm not a woman. Those were the two things that they would say every morning waking up. Now, that sounds absolutely crazy coming out of anyone's mouth, right? There's some people we would expect to say those things, but still, in our day to modern day, that sounds absolutely wild. But it was the box that the Pharisees lived in. It was the way that they lived their lives, and it was the way they expected others to as well. Now, we would be remiss if we did not see the parallels between the Pharisees and the church today. I'd love to say that history does not repeat itself, but often, as it so often happens, it does. And the consensus on the church today It goes a little something like this. Jesus sounds great. He was a great teacher. He's awesome. The church, not so much. So often what we hear, the first thing out of people's mouth who are uncomfortable with the idea of church is how judgmental Christians are. Some of us have been harmed by that very judgment. A lot of us have at one point or another. And at other times, we have been those people who have been the judges. We have been those people who have harmed others. I grew up in the South and in the Bible Belt, and this is all far too common where I grew up. It is so common for church people to be the most unloving, to be the most impatient with waiters and waitresses on a Sunday after church, and maybe heard love your neighbor, and then they gave a 5% tip afterwards. Like, great, thanks. You've shown me how you practice your religion. And so this was very common for me. And I even would get caught up in this as well. I remember in high school going through a phase where there just was certain places that I wouldn't sit in the lunchroom because I thought that that wasn't a good place to sit because of who was sitting there. And also even through, I remember there was there were a lot of kids who would go to Young Life at my school. And because I was the good pastor's kid, I stayed away from those Young Life kids because I knew that even though they went and heard about Jesus at club or whatever, that they partied on the weekend. And to me, that was unacceptable. And so later, it wasn't till later that I was introduced to a leader who kind of showed me a non-judgmental posture of looking at people and approaching life, that I was able to understand the singular focus or lens that I was looking at life through. This was the same lens that the Pharisees looked at life through, and this is often the same lens we look through when we make judgments. Maybe not as drastic or dramatic, but at times we make judgments that are often snap and often don't tell the whole truth about the person we are referring to. Kind of makes me think of those caricature pictures that you see at, I'm thinking specifically in Nickelodeon Universe, there's a certain place where you can go and you can see these caricature paintings or drawings, and they make even the most aesthetically beautiful people look awful. So I have some caricatures up here. This one, anyone know who this is? Obama. There you go. Yeah, we'll do a little quiz. All right. His teeth are not that large. Neither is his head. Yeah, absolutely, right? Who's this? Reba, yeah, nothing like Reba. All right. Yeah, that's obviously Reba. Her facial structure is not normally like that. Johnny Depp, yeah. Pretty accurate, right? Pretty accurate, actually. Just kidding. And then, anybody know this? Ariana Grande, yeah, absolutely. She kind of has dead eyes right there. Yeah. But you can see that caricatures rarely give us an accurate picture of what someone actually looks like and who they are. And this is often how much of the truth our judgments give regarding a person. And so judgment isn't altogether a bad thing. Often, judgment is what keeps us safe when we're in public, keeps us alert. It also is something that holds people accountable for the wrong that they've done. But this is not the kind of judgment that Jesus is addressing in the text. Now, if I were JD, I would double-click on this and I would give you the word study about it. But I am just going to tell you that the kind of judgment that Jesus is referring to is more akin to like condemnation. So it's harmful judgment that diminishes the dignity and humanity of the other person. It oppresses them and in turn oppresses the judger as well. What? We'll talk about that a little bit. But Jesus talks about, he refers to the plank in someone, of seeing a plank in your eye, which actually literally meant like a crossbeam. So literally think about like if you're cutting wood or something like that, and you see like a huge beam or construction or that, it was that large. That's what Jesus was referring to. But then he talks about sawdust in your neighbor or your friend's eye. Now, having anything in your eye sucks. Like, having anything in your eye is not fun. Like, you want to do your best to get it out. But clearly, having a crossbeam compared to sawdust, either way, it's going to suck. Either way, it's going to suck, but having a crossbeam is way worse than the other. Now, why are we so quick to give judgment to others when we know that we have flaws of our own? Why? Well, I think one, it's easy. It requires no reflection on our part. And also, we're not only, we're conditioned to do that by our world, to give those snap judgments, to decide the truth about a person before we understand who they really are. Just like those caricatures, and just like my inability to understand how really high up I was in the Sears Tower, we often don't see the full truth about a person before we make a judgment. And that's why this can be so uncomfortable for us to hear. Now, normally when someone comes up, the job is, when someone teaches or preaches, their job is to solve the tension in the text for you, but unfortunately that tension isn't solved for you today. Because this is something that requires interior examination on our part, which can be very hard because it also requires solitude. It also requires time to sit with ourselves and confront the truth about who we are in the midst of that, and how our actions have affected others. It can be very, very uncomfortable to have to sit with that truth and confront that in ourselves. But the beauty of this is that Jesus not only wants freedom for other people from judgment, from your judgment, but he wants freedom for you from judgment. Because, like I said, it not only oppresses the person that you are judging, it oppresses you as well. It only allows you to see things from a limited perspective rather than the full kingdom perspective that Jesus is inviting us into. Judgment is also largely how we assign. I talked about dignity. It's how we decide on who's in and who's out in communities largely. It's how we decide if a behavior is acceptable to be included in our community. And this is most often where people feel the sting of judgment, is inside the very communities that are supposed to include them and where they're supposed to belong. So we've been harmed by this, but we also harm others with this. And I know, I recognize that there are many places in the world where faith in Jesus costs way more than it does in American society at large. But I want to say that the stakes are very high for our witness to not include this anymore. They are incredibly high for us to no longer participate in these harmful judgments, these caricatures that paint a singular perspective on who a person is. The stakes are incredibly high, and we must join Jesus and accept his invitation to honestly reflect on how our actions, our judgments affect others and how they affect us as well. It keeps us from seeing people as created in the image of God. It keeps us from that. Now, often when someone comes to faith, in Jesus, there are definitely stories of miraculous healing where sight is restored and things like that in the Gospels. But some of the stories we see are directly about sight. When Paul has his beautiful encounter with Jesus, he actually loses his sight. But elsewhere, we think of one of the most popular hymns in Christian history, Amazing Grace. It was written by a guy named John Newton. He was a slave trader, but once he came to faith in Jesus, he became an abolitionist, and he wrote this song that at the very end says, I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. What Jesus desires for us is that our sight would be restored from judgment, that we would have freedom from making snap judgments about others, and from also being judged ourselves by others. Now, sometimes judgment can be a good thing because it sets right things wrong. But rarely is our judgment righteous as God's is. Rarely, just like anger, rarely is our anger righteous like God's is as well. And so when we think of judgment, that's something to consider. We've heard the phrase, there's no hate like Christian love. And often people will say, oh, I'm just giving you tough love. But they forgot the love part and just did the tough. And so I want us to consider, again, as we think and talk through this, I know that we are trying to be a community that is an anomaly in the poor witness that the Christian church has given to the world at times. I know that we are trying to do that. But I want us to honestly reflect on how our judgments affect the world around us and affect our neighbors as well. This is not just for our neighbors. God wants freedom from judgment for us as well, because it blinds us from seeing from a kingdom perspective, and it blinds us from participating fully in the kingdom that is available to us right now. So I'd like you to take a few minutes to discuss at your table, and then we'll be right back up here in a little bit.